Welcome to our training series on schizophrenia spectrum disorders and evidence-based care, specifically for volunteer supporters. So this is part 3 of a training, of the training series supporting people with schizophrenia. Part 1 covered the basics of schizophrenia. In the second module, we talked about evidence-based practices and taking a person-centered approach. And in this module, we'll talk about what you can do to help support people with schizophrenia. So let's take a look at our presenters today. These individuals will share some more of their experience when they introduce themselves. But we have 3 clinicians, all from different perspectives and a long history of working with this population and working with the peer community and families and individuals with serious mental illness. So on the next slide, we just want to introduce some objectives. So the goal is that at the end of the session, you should have an increased ability to participate in a supporting role to people living with schizophrenia. That could be as a volunteer supporter in the CARE Act process, but it could also just be as a friend, as a colleague, as a peer, as a family member, in better understanding how you can support them. And then also, you should have an increased ability to explain specific tools that can be used to help support people with schizophrenia. So let's go through our agenda today. We're going to overview a lot of different tools, and those include taking a trauma-informed approach, building rapport, meeting people where they're at, how to respond to symptoms, and then just briefly overviewing supported decision-making framework. And we have additional trainings on that. And then also we'll take a look at the 10 cornerstones of a recovery model and how that might apply to individuals with serious mental illness and schizophrenia. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn the time over to my colleagues to begin discussing these principles. So do you want to jump in and introduce yourselves?
Yes, thank you, Patricia. I'll get started. My name's Mark Avery. As you heard in the earlier modules, I'm a psychiatrist that's worked for a number of years and has had the privilege of providing services to many persons with schizophrenia spectrum conditions over the years. In this third section of the training module, we're going to pivot to talking about skills that supporters can utilize in providing your support to persons living with schizophrenia. When we use that term supporters throughout this training series, this is in reference to individuals that provide support to care program recipients, including volunteer supporters, family members, friends, colleagues, etc. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic right off to my colleague, Dave Leon, to start right off talking about how we can support persons who are living with schizophrenia spectrum. Dave?
Thanks so much, Mark. I just want to briefly introduce myself. I've been a social worker for 20 years. I've been working in mental health for 25 years. I have always been closely associated with working with people with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, and it's really what got me into the field to begin with. And I started an organization called Painted Brain, which is an arts organization dedicated to giving an artistic space where people with serious mental health issues can actually connect with each other, feel safe, and feel like they have a sense of purpose. I have several close friends that have schizophrenia. I have several professional colleagues that have schizophrenia. And I think that it's a very misunderstood illness, and I'm excited to talk with you all about it. As you think about from the supporter role, walking into a room with somebody that you're going to support for the first time and meeting them, I think the first thing you want to think about, the first thing we all want to think about is like, what do our brains actually do for us? You know, for most people with neurotypical brains, our brains are handling enormous amounts of information at once and creating a seamless, conscious narrative that sort of keeps us centered and aware. So what are we handling? You know, our brain is taking in information from every sensory system we have, you know, sight, sound, physical touch, our inner sense of anxiety. It's also making sense of our emotions. It's making sense of our thoughts. It's making sense of our memories. And it's turning all of this somehow, amazingly, into a single stream of clear, conscious thought. And it's important to recognize sort of how we take that for granted when we think about working with somebody or meeting somebody that has a psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, because at some level, something in that sort of smooth stream of thought and interaction within the brain is acting differently in that person. They might not have a connection to their emotions. They might not understand how their memories are impacting their current experience. They might experience hallucinations, meaning that their sensory system is creating information that isn't there. Visions, auditory hallucinations, tactile experiences that aren't really there from anyone else's perspective. But for that person, that experience is incredibly real and possibly very scary. So as we think about sort of meeting a person with schizophrenia for the first time, it's really important to do a self-evaluation and self-check-in. When you meet somebody with schizophrenia, they might appear different than what you'd expect. They might not make eye contact. They might not smile a lot. They might look very serious. They might not interact with you at all, or they might look like they're not really pleased to see you. And I think it's really important to try to center ourselves, think about where we are, and think about sort of turning on our observational skills. As we go to the next slide, we'll think a little bit more about how to do that and what we're looking for. So as we prepare to meet somebody, we've talked about this person, Carl, who's a older rocker who is has some delusions about alien invasion of the Earth, has some hallucinations around auditory and visual challenges that he really doesn't like and treats with medication. But most of all, he's like a guy who's into classic rock and loves his dog and loves his sister, and he's just trying to get through his life. And so as a supporter, if you're going in to meet with this person, you got to sort of prepare and think about what are you observing and what are you trying to observe right off the bat. So as you move to the next slide, we'll think a little bit about sort of what do we want to try to observe about a person as we start to meet in and move into a conversation. Before we get into that, let's just think a little bit about trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is, as it says on the screen, a set of principles that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and well-being. In my own sort of lay language, trauma-informed knowledge is really being aware and thoughtful about the fact that you are about to meet somebody who may have experienced very significant trauma in their life through dislocation, through stigma, through actual violence they might have experienced. Trauma-informed care is a mindset where we try to observe and understand people's behaviors through the lens of trauma. So if somebody is aggressive, is verbally acting out, is very shut down, is not making eye contact, it's important to sort of think about those things as possible repercussions of this person's trauma history. Maybe they're very on edge because they've been hurt by other people in the past, and that's why they're so aggressive or so assertive or so hard to connect with at the beginning. When you meet somebody and just get to know them, you don't know what they've been through. So a trauma-informed care lens is kind of bringing in the knowledge that this person probably has experienced trauma, and a lot of what we're seeing from them is probably a result of that experience. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so there's two things that I think are really important to think about when we're trying to connect with somebody that we're meeting for the first time with schizophrenia or any serious mental health issue or trauma history. We want to be first observant of ourselves and calm ourselves. And then we want to try to observe two things in this person that we're meeting before we get into actually discussing or talking to them. What's their state of mind? You know, what does it look like this person is feeling? Do they look like very emotional? Do they look very flat? Do they look very angry? Do they look very agitated? Do they look really happy? Do they look really satisfied with their life? Maybe they're excited about something. Try to observe their sort of emotional state. Next, I think before sharing anything with this person, we want to try to also observe their physical experience, their physical presentation. A lot of people try to demonstrate something about themselves through the way they dress or the way they present themselves. And we try to pick up on that. So what we're looking for is things like special haircut, a tattoo that's obvious, really impressive jewelry, really blinged out shoes, something about the way this person is dressing that seems intentional, or something that they're trying to show about themselves. What we're demonstrating by observing these things is that we're paying attention, we're thinking about them first, we're not thinking about their diagnosis, we're thinking about them as a person. So as we use these sort of observations, probably the first best step is to really start with an observation. You introduce yourself, say that why you're there, you're here as a supporter, and then you move on to maybe asking about something that you see on their person, like, wow, that's a really intense tattoo you have on your shoulder there. Tell me a little bit about it. You know, that might be a great way to open up the conversation and show that you're listening and attentive and aware of what that person's trying to show you. That question might also serve as a bridging question to comment on what you're seeing with the emotional resonance of this person. And then it might be helpful to tie that into the situation they're in. You know, you're in a court system and we're meeting for the first time. There's a lot of intense conversation around us. It makes sense that you might be agitated or upset. You know, I noticed earlier that you seem kind of nervous or uncomfortable. Is that accurate? So you're giving some context of why a person might be feeling what they're feeling, and then you sort of ask gently about what they're feeling and try to check in with them about that. So these are really sort of basic ideas for how to start off the very first moments of developing a rapport with a person with schizophrenia or somebody that you're trying to care for. One thing to really think about is that it's important to not expect the things that you might expect from other interpersonal connections. You might not get a lot of eye contact. You might not get a lot of appreciation that you're there. Or you might get a sense that the person's not even taking in the fact that you're there. As we move on to the next slide, it's really important to try to calm yourself and focus on being with this person as opposed to trying to get them to communicate with you directly. Another great toolkit to have, and another option that I found very useful in my work with people with schizophrenia over the years, is to have a whole list or set of ideas about nonverbal communication styles, ways to spend time with this new person that you're getting to know that are not dependent on talking or face-to-face conversation. So some ideas about that are taking a walk, playing a card game or a board game, bringing one in with you, you know, bringing a small puzzle that you might be able to do together, drawing with each other, drawing something on a page and then passing it to them and having them draw more, listening to music or asking what kind of music they like, or possibly going on a walk. It's important to be okay with silence. It's also important to recognize that sometimes people talk and open up more when they're doing something else in the moment. So playing a card game might actually be a great way to get the conversation started, whereas just asking the person a question might be too overwhelming. Thanks. Let's go on to the next slide.
Dave, let's just stick with that for one moment.
Thank you, please, Deborah.
You've given a couple of great examples, and when we think about Carl, our fictional case story, there's lots of things that we could do. Take a walk with his dog, right? Ask him about his favorite band, listen to some of the music together. Years ago, I used to keep a Lego set partially done on my desk. It was so engaging. Folks would come in and just maybe add a couple of pieces. And when I was in training, I had a really fortunate experience of working at a clinic that there was a horse stable nearby. And we would sometimes take a walk to the horse stable and pet the horses. And it was such an impactful, quiet, calming moment to be able to engage with a person without pressure to talk, to be intrusive, to ask questions. And so I love some of the examples that you gave. And when I think about Carl, how we might apply them.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. Thanks. I think that I've really enjoyed working with people with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder over the years because I actually get to slow down myself to be with them. And just focusing on being with somebody as opposed to communicating verbally or, you know, asking and sharing questions is actually a great experience for a lot of us to try to center, calm ourselves, and just be with each other. So thank you, Deborah. Let's go on to the next slide. All right. So a lot of what we've talked about so far is really about trying to meet the person where they are, observe them, and try to join with them in their world as opposed to trying to pull them into our world. I had this happen just the other day where one of my students, a social work intern, sat down with a woman with schizophrenia, and she told me afterwards, like, I couldn't get this person to talk to me. And my response to my student was, it sounds like you weren't really listening to that person very well, because maybe they didn't want to talk. Maybe they just wanted to be with you. Maybe you need to think about other ways to connect as opposed to trying to pull them into answering the questions you have. I'd like to pass it back to Mark because he has a comment. Thank you.
Oh, I just wanted to underscore a little bit of what you were just saying, Dave, is I just wanted to really draw people's attention to the title of the slide, which is Meet the Person Where They Are At, as opposed to where we are at. And we're also always in a certain place when we're meeting with persons. And it is totally human nature for us to get caught up in our space. And especially in clinic environments, court environments, fast-paced world, we tend to start running behind almost immediately. Very often we feel pressure to complete a certain form. We have to get XYZ done. And see that second bullet there. It's important not to lay that on the person here and not to push for that information. I like to think of it as little tiny meditation episodes that I always do just before going to meet a person for the first time. I take 5 to 10 seconds. I do a 2 or 3 deep breaths and remind myself that this is about the person in the room and not about me. I'm here to meet them where they're at. Dave.
Thanks, Mark. And actually, to tie that back to Carl for a second, one of the things that we've mentioned about Carl over and over is that he's got different moods and different feelings on different days. Sometimes he's very loquacious and conversational and like to talk about his old times. Other times he's more afraid and more shut down and more sort of focused and serious. As a supporter with Carl, if you know him for a long time, you have to realize that every single day you meet him, he might be in a different place. Some days he might be very appreciative of the fact that you showed up. Some days he might not be able to acknowledge what you're doing for him or appreciate the fact that you've made time to see him. And it's really important to try to not take that personally and recognize that this person is possibly dealing with some very intense symptoms or fears or challenges, and that sometimes he's not going to be able to give you the gratification of a smile and a thank you at the end of your conversation with him. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't appreciate what you're offering. It's just that he can't express it at the moment. So I think it's always important, even when you know somebody, to meet them where they are, even if they might be different than they were the last time you saw them. Thanks. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So in previous sessions of this training, we've talked a lot about what hallucinations and delusions are, but how do you relate to them and support somebody that's having these experiences as a supporter? If somebody is glancing around and looking at things that don't seem to be there in front of you, they might be actively having psychotic symptoms at the moment. They might be responding to things that you don't see, seeing visions that you don't see. It's important to stay calm and supportive and be an open sort of source to talk about what they're experiencing without judgment and without sort of preconceptions. If the person with schizophrenia really trusts you, they might even ask you like, hey, I'm hearing people screaming in the background in my head, and I'm not sure if it's real or not. Can you tell me, are you hearing that too? And that's a sign of trust that they're actually allowing you to give some feedback about whether the hallucination they're experiencing is real or not. I think that the important thing is to not feel like you have the solutions and not feel like you have to solve any problem. You're there with the person, you're connecting with them, and you're trying to experience the world through their lens and through their eyes and through their experiences. So being curious, being supportive, and asking questions is always a really good way to react to hallucinations. Now, delusions can be a little bit more challenging. Some people have very fixed delusions. Carl, for example, has a fixed belief that aliens have invaded our world and that all the evil and badness that we see is due to these aliens that have come in from another planet. The supporter might be thinking like, okay, how do I respond to this? Do I agree? Do I disagree? I think it's really important to take a neutral stance. It's okay to share your own view. I don't personally believe that aliens have invaded our planet, but I don't know everything. You have your perspective on things, I have mine. And it's important to take a sort of neutral, accepting stance and not challenge that person's delusion or tell them that they're wrong about it. It's important to validate feelings and beliefs. And you don't have to challenge the belief to recognize that this belief is having a huge impact on that person's state of mind or emotions. Wow, if you believe that aliens have infected our world, That must be really scary for you. That must feel very overwhelming. Let's talk about the feeling related to that. You know, how do you cope with that? Don't rush. Don't feel like you have to gain this person's trust faster than they're ready to. And it's really important to, as Mark said, slow yourself down and try to meet that person where they are and be with them where they are and understand their perspective on things. Thanks. Let's go to the next slide. As a supporter in the court process, you might be a person that this person with schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders is talking to about their experience of the court process. That might be a positive experience, it might be a negative experience. I think our role as a supporter is to honor and ensure that we're listening to this person, that we're understanding things from their perspective, and that we're also trying to remain neutral about things that they're upset about. We might need to sort of keep reminding people about some of the realities they're facing, like this court is going to expect things from you. They do want to talk to you. And you want to acknowledge things that you have no control over changing, or that might be hard realities that this person needs to face. But you want to do that in a supportive and caring way, as opposed to a, you need to do this kind of way. We're in a role of support and encouragement and guidance, and we're not in a role of enforcement and criticism or judgment. Thanks. Let's move on to Mark, if you have any comments on this.
I think I made my comment earlier that I was going to say here, just that is to just, keep in mind how that experience of going through the court might be. Going through a court experience is scary for everyone. So just imagine the additional challenge that might be playing a role in somebody who's also coping with a schizophrenia spectrum condition at the same time. So that's all I had to say, Dave.
Thank you so much. We're going to bring it over to Deborah for our next slide. Deborah Rose, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, and hi, everyone. We've met in some of the other earlier presentations, but I'm happy to join you again. Introduce myself again. I'm Deborah Rose. I'm a psychologist in New York, and I have spent the last 20 years of my career working with individuals with serious mental illness in a variety of not-for-profit social service settings, including hospitals, outpatient clinics, and for a few years overseeing behavioral health across Rikers Island jail system. So this work is something that I'm passionate and feel committed to doing. I do really want to stress the slide, person first language. And I think, and I hope that you've heard us using person first language throughout this presentation. What really matters is that this is not, as a supporter, as a provider, as a friend or family member, as a volunteer supporter with the court, it's not about the diagnosis. It's about the person behind the diagnosis. And that's true for all of us. We want to be identified by who we are, what we believe in, what our values are, what matters to us, rather than the labels that accompany us. And so it's really important that when we think about individuals who are receiving services and who are part of the CARE Act, that it's not a schizophrenic, it's a person who's living with schizophrenia. And I will encourage you to think about how you can consider person-centered language in all of the work that we do throughout our interactions. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? So in keeping with that and recognizing that people who are living with schizophrenia and other kind of psychotic disorders, moving away from the stigma about schizophrenia and moving towards these are individuals who are living with very complicated, challenging conditions. Folks with schizophrenia tend to be objectified by their diagnosis rather than humanized by people who have strengths and hopes and dreams. When we think about Carl, he has a dog that he loves. He has a sister who matters to him. He likes rock music. These are wonderful things about Carl. And so we want to move away from the diagnosis and the label to the idea, to the fact that people are complicated individuals who bring strengths, needs, preferences, with them. And so I think I really do want to draw attention to the fact that living with schizophrenia is something that we need to be compassionate about when we think about the fact that individuals who are living with this condition are often the recipient and the victim of violence rather than perpetrators. When we think about supporting and caring about people, to keep in mind that these are folks who, have and are more likely to be in situations where they're abused or neglected or victimized. So it's really essential that in all of our roles that we think about care, support, that open-mindedness that Dave talked about earlier, asking questions, keeping a beginner's mind. I don't know much about you and your experience. Tell me more about that. And even for folks, for family members who have known the individual for 20, 30, 40 years, I don't know much about your experience today. Tell me more about you and how you are today. So again, just encouraging you to think about the person and the strengths that accompany the individuals that we are supporting through the process. Why don't we go to the next slide on recovery? I love this slide. This really talks about the fact that recovery is not a one and done, one shot deal. It's not about an immediate cure. It's about the fact that for any of us, the path of recovery for wellness, for health, for the embodiment of our whole spirit is a journey. And when we think about what really matters in behavioral health and in substance use recovery is the idea that each of the people that we're working with come to this with different paths, with different journeys. And there's going to be fits and starts and strengths and occasional setbacks, and that it's about partnering through that journey together. And so what's on the screen are just some of the 10 basic components of the recovery model. And I'll go over them quickly, and I'll invite you to spend some time after the webinar to really look into them a little bit further. But self-direction. People should be empowered and have the right to make choices for themselves, and to have options and preferences recognized. We've talked about person-centeredness. Again, people have strengths, needs, preferences, and they should be guided. Services and support should be guided by that person-centered model. What's important to the person in front of us? What's important to Carl is the example. Holistic recovery is not just about treatment. It's about really thinking about the whole body, about the need for purpose, about spirituality, about things that matter to the person, about physical health and wellness, about relationships and community. So it's considering more than just the diagnosis and the focus on the diagnosis and the treatment and the recovery that goes with the diagnosis, but thinking about the entire person. I'm going to go to peer support. I can't say enough about mutual support from people with lived experience, family members with lived experiences, people who have experienced serious mental illnesses themselves. Peer supports come in a variety of flavors, and they are just absolutely essential for mentorship, for coaching, for hope, for support. I think that the opportunity to avail oneself to peer support is just such a major aspect of one's individual recovery. Respect comes in a lot of flavors. Respect for the individual, respect for our experience in supporting an individual. For the supporters who are listening to this, respect to understand that I might not know what that person is experiencing today, and I want to ask and learn more about it. And also respecting the process in each other and our own stressors and challenges going through that process. And I'm going to move on to hope, the idea that recovery is really based on hope for the good things that are to come and the kind of partnerships and relationships that can be built based on hope. So again, if we go back to Carl and we think about his strengths, his preferences, he's had periods of life where he is adhering to medication. He has a sister who he cares about, who cares about him. He's got a dog that he loves. He's able to take care of this little creature. There's lots of things that we would be thinking about when we consider supporting Carl in his path to recovery. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn this back over to my colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. Yeah, thinking about supported decision making, and in reference to Carl, I think it's important to think about the history of sort of Western society's treatment of mental health and schizophrenia specifically. For a lot of our history, it's not been a pretty picture, and a lot of decisions have been taken away from people that have been identified as having schizophrenia. A lot of decisions historically have been made for them as if they're not capable of making decisions for themselves. The supported decision-making framework is really a recognition and a sort of more humanistic approach to this human challenge that people have. And the basis of it is really recognizing that the person that lives with schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder is the core of their decision making about the treatment they want and the kinds of services they desire. We looked at all the different sort of treatment options and sort of opportunities for growth and development in different ways. But the supported decision making process is really looking at focusing on that person first and deciding like which of these factors, which of these possible treatment options work best for you. So thinking back to Carl, some of the decisions that he's made in his life and his journey with support from others is that he's decided to be on an injectable medication because it helps him with his hallucinations that he does not like. He actually has generally chosen to live on the streets because he likes the environment. He likes access to having his dog with him at all times. And he's found ways to sort of survive on the streets in Los Angeles with the friend network that he's made. And he's also very clear about sort of the kinds of treatment that he does and does not want. You know, he is open to support and work and play and employment support as long as it's fitting his sort of philosophical ideas about work, meaning that he wants to be only doing work that is helpful to others in a direct way. And he also has been really resistant to kinds of treatments that are more focused on like substance use and those kind of interventions. And so supported decision making overall is just a way to recognize that the person that we're trying to care for is at the center of their decision making about what kinds of care they want. And to the best of their ability, should be making decisions about what they want to see in their treatment plan and the people that are involved in them in their life. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to pass it back to Patricia for some final thoughts here.
Thank you. So we can turn and look at these ideas at a glance and just note some of the things that we've talked about today. So approaching an individual with schizophrenia with humility and compassion and really taking that trauma-informed approach, building rapport and trust. You may have a long-standing relationship with this individual as a supporter. Maybe you're intentionally changing your role, but meeting them with rapport and trust. And meeting them where they're at in what Mark and Deborah and Dave were speaking, and withholding judgment, going to where they are at, supporting them in their decisions. We also talked about responding to hallucinations and delusions, and not necessarily challenging the belief, but acknowledging their feelings and how it must feel for them to be experiencing that. And also how to support somebody through a court process. It's a very formal setting with lots of steps, complications. So how can you as a supporter and other natural supports, but understand how that may be experienced for them, especially if they have former justice involvement that wasn't comfortable for them, how to acknowledge that this court system and process may not be intuitive and to help prepare them for that. And Deborah spoke to us about using person-first language and how that's really a shift in mentality and seeing them as a whole person and really humanizing those individuals with schizophrenia. And then using principles of recovery model or supported decision-making and how that can help you as a supporter. We do have trainings on supported decision-making. That is a specific model for the supporter to use in the CARE Act in their role. That is, like Dave said, a neutral role, one that's supporting them. And this may be difficult if you've had a long-standing relationship with this individual. You are invested. You want them to make certain decisions. And that's okay. That's that you want the best outcome for them, but just understanding this role as a supporter is about being neutral, helping provide them supports, keeping their preferences and needs at the center in the care process. So this ideas in action, how do we put these ideas into action while we're supporting individuals? So what are some specific things that you can say and do differently as a result of this training? Think about the individual that you're supporting, if you know them well, if you don't know them well, how you can build that rapport through words and actions, how you can practice being more accepting, observant, and supportive, and then adapt to using person-centered language in your everyday life. Some things that you might say is, would you like to take a walk right before this meeting? Or, I admire your creativity. Can you teach me how to draw? Or things like, this has to be really scary to feel that way. Or, what do you think we can do to reduce stress before your court date? So building that rapport, using accepting, observant, and supportive language. And then, of course, you being person-centered in your language and also in your mentality and how you see this individual. They may have schizophrenia, but they're a whole person. They have strengths, they have weaknesses, they have preferences. And so to see them in a holistic way. So we're going to just briefly touch back on our objectives for this call. The goal was at the end of this module to have an increased ability to participate in a supporting role to people living with schizophrenia, and then explain how specific tools can be used to help support people living with schizophrenia. And we have a few next steps that we'd like to highlight for you. Is we have more resources for you on the CARE Act website. There's a specific corner where we have collected information and tools and strategies specific for the volunteer supporter role. And then we have a number of other trainings, including the 2 other trainings in this series. This is the third in a 3-part series. The first one was about schizophrenia basics. The second one was evidence-based practices. And in this module, we tried to help you understand tools that you could use in your supporting role. So we thank you for your participation, and I thank my colleagues for sharing their experiences over the past 20-25 years working with this population and how we can be more supportive to them. Thank you for your participation, and we will see you in other trainings.